And joining us now, returning to the program, is Ryan Grimm. You know Ryan Grimm's work from the Huffington Post and now The Intercept, where he is Washington bureau chief. He is also the author of several books. He is a political commentator, in addition to that, for the Young Turks, where I used to be a regular. So we travel in a lot of the same circles. In addition, he is part of Strong Arm Press, the publishing organization, and he has an upcoming book coming out through Strong Arm Press entitled We've Got People, The Rise of a New Force in American Politics. He had a semi-excerpt from it out on Nancy Pelosi that I found fascinating, and he's got a new scoop that he is willing to talk to us about. So without any further ado, Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, it's great to be here, RJ.
Well, it's great to see you, and we love scoops around here, so hit us.
Right, so as you saw this week, Hakeem Jeffries beat Representative Barbara Lee by 10 votes to become caucus chair, which is the position that Joe Crowley held up until that election, as a matter of fact. And Crowley even oversaw the proceedings, because that's the tradition that the outgoing chair, oversees all of the caucus elections, including in this case the election for his own position. During the after the votes were all cast, he, as you might remember, he famously played "Born to Run" the night that he lost his primary, and he dedicated it to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This time, he played an Irish funeral song to the caucus. It created a very somber tune. But the scoop is that earlier, heading into the vote, Crowley had not been apart from the election, and in fact was doing what he could to support Hakeem Jeffries, his New York protege. And part of that support was to go around and tell other Democrats that Barbara Lee had given money to Ocasio-Cortez, which paints Barbara Lee then as part of this insurgency that all of the incumbents are worried is going to cost them their elections.
So let me put your scoop in a little context for the listeners who most of our listeners are political junkies, but just in case anyone isn't clear on that. So Joe Crowley, who's kind of a machine Democratic politician, loses in the primary to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a rise superstar of the left now. Barbara Lee, stalwart hero of the left for many years, sole vote in the House, for example, as I recall, one of the few votes against the Iraq War, left hero of many years, in a tight race with Hakeem Jeffries, who, as you point out, is Joe Crowley's protege in the New York political operation. Also, by the way, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, also extremely close to Success Academy and the charter school movement and other things that are kind of anathema to the left. So Joe Crowley, on his way out, supervises the election for his replacement. And what you're telling us is that he had definitely had his thumb or his entire hand on the scale, trying to skew things against Barbara Lee by basically making all the incumbent Democratic politicians afraid that she's going to try to undermine them. Do I have it basically right?
That's right. And it was extremely effective. And so after I heard that he had done this, I went around, and when I could find House Democrats in the hallway, I would say, did you know that Barbara Lee had given money to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign? And almost universally, they were they would say, "What, she did?" It was viewed as tantamount to treason. Now, the truth is that she did cut a check, but she cut her a check 2 weeks after the primary, which is a fairly standard phenomenon in Congress. There's an incoming Democrat, and you send her some money from your PAC to her PAC in order to say welcome to Washington. And in fact, later Raul Grijalva gave her money, the Congressional Progressive Caucus gave her money, and even Steny Hoyer gave her contribution. So it's not as if it actually did represent support during the primary. And I talked to Barbara Lee about it, and Barbara Lee said not only did she not support Ocasio-Cortez's primary campaign against Crowley, she actually didn't even know that Crowley had a primary campaign. Now, this was not a high-profile there's not a high-profile race. What it shows is that she apparently doesn't read The Intercept on a daily basis. But if she was only reading the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or San Francisco Chronicle, then of course she wouldn't have learned about this race, and she would have learned that he had lost the same time that 99% of the country learned, which was on that election night. So then 2 weeks later, she gave money. But the Ocasio-Cortez, floated Barbara Lee for Speaker. Ro Khanna endorsed Barbara Lee for caucus chair. Ocasio-Cortez later endorsed her for caucus chair. So in some ways, she was kind of susceptible to the charge. And at the same time, some supporters of Lee probably hope that the charge actually is true, that if she got into leadership, she would be doing the things that Crowley implied. And so it was dirty, but also fit with a narrative that she was susceptible to.
Well, of course, a good dirty trick is one that people are going to believe, right?
Right.
So, and again, Ryan Grim, just to be clear for our listeners, so what Joe Crowley did here, long-term establishment Democratic politician, what he did here was he basically deceived people, because grossly deceived people, because if you tell an incumbent Democrat that their greatest fear, as you pointed out, is a primary from the left for most of these folks, that Barbara Lee helped somebody do that and helped them unseat him, no less, one of the top Democrats in the House, then you're declaring Barbara Lee an enemy, whereas the money that Barbara Lee did give, since it was after the primary, it was for a Democratic nominee. It's a completely different thing. It's completely, as you say, in line with the way standard politics operates. So this qualifies in my mind as like a Nixon level dirty trick.
What's revealing about it, though, is that even if members of Congress would have learned that it came 2 weeks after the primary, for many, that's the body's still warm there. There is so much fear about what Ocasio-Cortez represents to incumbent Democrats that even that close of an association with her, likely would have still been damaging, even if you showed them the actual FEC report. And I talked to Dan Kildee, who was a public supporter of Jeffries and spoke in the private meeting, on his behalf. And he told me, I didn't know that, Lee had given her money, that definitely is a problem. And I said, well, does it matter to you that it actually came after the primary? And he said, well, that's somewhat less of a problem. But notice the somewhat there. In other words, that's still a problem. And if you think about that, it's extraordinarily revealing about the cleavages in the party now. If a Democrat giving money after the primary to another member of the Democratic caucus is still considered even somewhat of a problem, that means that they're viewing each other at least somewhat as enemies or adversaries. And frankly, they should. They're like the Dan Kildees of the world are not necessarily wrong about what the Ocasio-Cortez's view of the world is of a lot of the incumbents in Congress.
And by the way, I personally want them to be that thing that they, that's...
Which helps the charge stick. But yeah, it's interesting for Lee because she, like you said, she's got this iconoclastic image from her vote against the use of force just days after 9/11, very courageous vote in that period. But she actually, and she was volunteered with the Black Panthers in the 1960s. So she has this kind of radical and iconoclastic cred. But she's also been, a team player with the establishment in a lot of cases. I believe she backed Buffy Wicks in the in the closely watched assembly race recently between kind of a more radical Jovanka Beckles and a more establishment Buffy Wicks in Berkeley. She's always been a kind of a team player with Pelosi. She's kind of a Pelosi ally. And so you have kind of a dueling images of who Barbara Lee is, and what Crowley was doing was trying to elevate the left image rather than the more team player image that exists.
So is this in a way, and I'm asking you to speculate here, Ryan Grim, but is this in any way, you think, a harbinger of future battles within the Democratic Party? I mean, I ask that for two different reasons, really, I would say. One is, when they were doing the head counts and talking about it kind of semi behind the scenes before this leadership vote, both Jeffries and Barbara Lee were saying they had the votes. Mm-hmm. So, number one, is this seems to be a charge that not only alarms people like Dan Kildee, who have every right to be alarmed, but maybe people on the fence too, maybe the new Democratic caucus, a lot of these newly electeds who were recruited from military and intelligence backgrounds and so on were persuaded by that. But so I asked for that reason, and also because it's a Democratic Party basically is the centrist or whatever you want to call it, establishment wing of the party likely now to sort of go on in something of a witch hunt against the new left insurgents of the party.
Right, but they want to be careful about how they do it because they know the energy is with progressives and with the left, and so you don't want to wind up on the wrong side of that energy. What they want to do is take that energy and channel it into their own power. And so if they can continue to have situations like this, then they're happy with the outcome. Not terribly happy. Joe Crowley was a beloved figure in the House caucus. Brian Higgins called him the most popular guy on campus. But if they lose Joe Crowley in the caucus chair position and replace him with Hakeem Jeffries, his protege from the neighboring district, who similarly gets more than 98% of his money from PACs and large donors, then the system goes on, like in Terminator
right.
2, the way that they
right.
you shoot the guy's arm off and it kind of reconstitutes itself.
Right, and if you blow up Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Skynet will just send somebody else, and as we've just seen. Now, the one person I think perhaps in the Democratic caucus who wasn't fond of Joe Crowley but did support him was Nancy Pelosi, right? Because he didn't he challenge her at one point? I thought he had.
He had kind of been floating out there as a potential challenger, but at the same time has always been a close ally of hers in the complicated way that these dynamics go.
Yeah, and I have to say, by the way, you mentioned Joe Crowley playing the guitar and singing. As someone who used to do that for a living, I guess my parting words to Joe Crowley would be, keep your day job. Oh, right, you lost your day job. I'm sorry.
He will be just fine. He just showed that he can still manipulate an outcome in the House Democratic caucus, which is I don't want to call it a priceless commodity in Washington because a price will be put on it, but it's awfully valuable.
Right, and so you're suggesting Joe may have a comfortable second career singing on K Street? Is that what you're?
Right, actually, and he does. He'll go to a lot of fundraisers in that role, and he can play his guitar at each one.
Well, maybe I'll offer to team up with him for something. But before we let you go, speaking of relics of the Democratic Party establishment, we only have about a minute. I'll talk about this more. I did a piece for Alternate and Salon about the insurgency against Nancy Pelosi coming from the right and from centrists and all that, and you were able to point out something I did not know, which is the connection of this so-called problem solvers caucus, which is really bipartisan corporate hacks, is the way I would describe them. But is there a connection with Mark Penn, who I used to cover years ago? Mark Penn well, I'd say emblematic of everything that's been wrong with the Democratic Party for a number of years. But we don't have a lot of time to go into it. But were you surprised to discover the Penn connection, Mark Penn connection, in the fight to either unseat Nancy Pelosi or tie her hands and give the Republicans more power?
I mean, yes and no. Like everything with Mark Penn, it's both surprising and completely believable at the same time. But yeah, his wife Nancy Jacobson and he, founded this group No Labels, which then created the Problem Solvers Caucus and spent millions through super PACs to help get them reelected this last election cycle. Nancy Jacobson takes no salary from No Labels, and Mark Penn pretends to have no role whatsoever in it, though I found a lot of evidence that shows that that's completely untrue and that he's directly involved in a day-to-day way in the operations of No Labels and by extension the Problem Solvers Caucus through his constellation of different firms that work in complementary and sometimes even conflicting ways.
You know what the Surgeon General discovered in the 60s would help people stop smoking cigarettes and stop developing lung cancer, interestingly enough, was labels. So I think there's a lot to be said for labeling products so you know what you're getting into. So there's never no label. What's that?
It's good. Labels are important.
Labels are important. You want to know what you're buying. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but Ryan Grim of The Intercept and Strong Arm Press and so much more. As always, great reporting. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
All right, see you next time.